Learn for NOI Education Services, and you are here for part 3 of Assessments That Matter, Fair and Consistent Results. If you didn't get a chance to see it, in part 1, we covered the new standards, which was all in and around explaining standard 1.3, 1.4. It was probably a little bit ranty, gonna be honest. It's a very sensitive subject for me. So we talk about all the things that I see in industry that drive me absolutely balmy in terms of poor assessment practices by both RTOs and trainers. In part 2, we covered how to do validation. So we talked about some of the best methods for validation where we see the best results. We're very, very fortunate. We work with a lot of really amazing RTOs, and we are actually able to put really cool practices into place with a lot of those RTOs. So we talked about how we utilize AI. It had a lot of there was a lot of practical suggestions. So part 1 was really like getting into the standards, getting into the nitty gritty. Part 2 was more practical solutions focused for your validation processes. And then today, part 3, we're going to be talking about when validation poses a problem. So, like for example, if you've got a validation and you take your documents through validation and you find an issue, what do you actually do in that particular circumstance? So I guess there's like 3 ways to look at it. So the first is like when we just got minor issues. These can be fixed internally where it's like, hey, we could probably flesh that, we could flesh that observation out a little bit more. Or, hey, we've accidentally mapped that to 1.3, but actually should we map to 1.2? Can we update the mapping guide? That's kind of a minor issue, okay? And what it means in that particular case is really not that you're not meeting the standards. It's generally like more administrative, or it's a continuous improvement. It's something along those sorts of issues. Then we start to get to a major issue, and that's where we find that the assessment tool itself is maybe not meeting a criteria. The most common one I see in those sorts of circumstances is definitely where the assessment design allows for a skill to be demonstrated, but there's no evidence of that skill within the actual assessment recording itself, okay? So for example, the assessment instructions say, as a student, you need to ride a bike for 5 kilometers from point A to point B. Okay. But in the observation, like there's no observation or anything that follows that. There's no form that the student uses to document that when they went from like the duration it took them to get from point A to point B. There's no observation checklist for the assessor to say, I actually saw them do point A to point B. Okay. And the other thing that we see very, very commonly is that students do this in the workplace, and it's not actually observed. So it's a reflection that they've done it in the workplace rather than the assessor is actually seeing them doing it in the workplace. We see that very, very commonly. It's probably the most common non-compliance with us, like with workplace-based assessment tools. And then with simulated assessment tools, the most common option, the most common non-compliance that we'll see is that the students are asked to plan and prepare to do something, but then it's not actually implemented, right? Implementing a policy and a procedure. So they don't then go to that extent of like rolling the policy out, okay? And I don't think it's that hard to actually implement a lot of those sorts of things, particularly like when it's like implement a policy. Implementing a policy is like sending an email out about the policy and then running a training session with staff, okay? That's how we implement the vast majority of our policies. What becomes a lot more difficult, particularly in simulation, is the monitoring and adapting. So this is often not covered in assessments very well. And I would say that for both that applies probably to both workplace-based and to simulated assessment tools, because monitoring and adapting means generally that you need to come up with a scenario whereby X hasn't been done or part of that policy hasn't been implemented, and the student then has to like apply or adapt for that. And we just don't see it covered very well in the vast majority of assessment tools for some reason. Like there is a lot of work that generally has to go in, particularly from a simulated perspective. There's a lot of supplemental documentation that needs to be developed. We've recently completed the advanced diploma of civil construction. We needed to engage civil engineers to develop plans, schematics. We had them working with us to develop, we built hydrological reports, geological reports, cultural heritage reports. So we had to work with like a whole range of people in order to develop all the supplemental documentation for these particular projects. And the time it takes to build that supplemental documentation it far exceeds the time it takes to build the actual assessment, like the observation checklists and the instructions and stuff like that. Assessment checklists and observations with AI nowadays, if you get your prompts right and everything like that, that's not the time consuming part. It's the assessment design process, which can't be done by AI. It can only be done by a human being. AI does a crap job of it. And then working out all the supplemental documentation so that you can get that really good simulated structure so that the student has enough documentation and evidence to be able to actually conduct the reviews and put everything into place. So that's often where we see a lot of RTOs struggle in terms of that assessment development side. A critical breach is when you've got a combination of assessment tools having like missing critical components and trainers and assessors not implementing the tools correctly and therefore missing large components of that or ticking and flicking and not really looking at the evidence, like not objectively looking at the evidence. Okay. So I want to talk mostly to where that's sort of the situation. Where you see that there are minor issues where you can flesh out observations, even in circumstances potentially where, the student has done the skill, but you haven't documented it well. Often what we see is a line in the sand approach, and I don't know how Asper's going to feel about that. But certainly I've seen them accept it before. As long as there's a clear pathway that all of the tools are then going to be improved based on that. Where you've got that combination of students not being assessed in something that is critical to the unit, that's where you really need to look at how wide your scope then needs to be. Okay. So the first thing I'm going to be looking at in that circumstance is it a tool? One, is it an issue with the tool? Okay. Two, is it an issue that the tool is like that tool is then affecting every single trainer, or is it only affecting some trainers? Because there are trainers out there who will take a look at that and then they'll supplement that, right? They'll supplement that with form that was undertaken. So there's still that really good evidence. Like I've got RTOs that had terrible tools in hospitality, and we came in and we affected the tools in hospitality. And when we did the validations, the RTO had been collecting videos of all of the students and photos of all the dishes that they'd been creating and everything like that. So when we did this review, we actually looked at the student evidence. We said, well, look, the tool is actually pretty critically non-compliant, but the additional evidence that you guys have been collecting against the students means that the assessment evidence that you've got is actually okay. So we can draw a line in the sand, we can improve all of the assessment tools, but we don't need to go back and be reassessing all of the students because you've collected all of this evidence. And so still see that there is evidence of competency there. Okay. And that's ultimately the process that you've got to go through. Where you then find that you've got massive chunks of evidence missing. Okay. So we've gone into other RTOs and we've done a review, and the assessment tool is non-compliant. It doesn't collect evidence of the practical skills well. And I always go back to hospitality, because hospitality is just, with the commercial cookery, the complexity of the units in order to create recipes that are actually fully compliant to those unit requirements is not an easy task. It's not something where you can just go, oh, we'll just do a fish dish and we'll just do a this dish, and like, there's so much complexity in making sure that you get all the cooking methods, that you get all of the ingredients correct, that that you get like all of those components pulling together to make sure that you're covering everything. It's very, very difficult. So that's like a really easy one for us to reference. But where you look at those skills, and the skills, there's no evidence that that particular skill has been met. Okay, then you need to look at how you're going to address that. So the first step that I will do is I will then go out and I will look at other units. Okay. Again, I'll take an example. We were going through and we did a validation on some assessment tools. We found the assessment tools were non-compliant. We didn't have evidence of the students doing it from that particular unit, but the students were doing they were doing a package of qualifications. It was like a Cert 3, Cert 4 diploma. And so what we were able to do in that particular circumstance, we were able to map back to a unit that all of the other students had, where they had done that particular skill. And so we were able to cover it then. So there's a whole bunch of methods that you need to kind of employ and start to look at, and go, let's say that this is a critical non-compliance. We don't have evidence of X, Y, and Z for the students. Do we have it from another unit? Do we have the evidence? We just don't have it mapped. Then if you get to a circumstance where you absolutely do not have that evidence, okay, the students that are still actively studying with you, you then bring them back. You then can look at it and go, right, can we fit this into their training moving forward? Right? Because we do want to, if we as the RTO haven't done the right thing in collecting the evidence, we do want to try and make the process as easy as possible for the students to be able to demonstrate that competency. We don't want to put students at a disadvantage just because we didn't do the right thing with the RTO. And it really does depend on the size and scale of this as to like how far you need to go back. Sometimes it's literally just one trainer and all the other trainers are like doing the right thing. And so there's PD that has to happen with the trainer. Whenever you find the non-compliance, my suggestion is always the following. One, you do a review into it, okay, and determine if it's the tool, if it's the student, if it's the trainer, if it's systematic, okay. Where it's systematic, okay, is where you need to go and then do that bigger external review. And quite often, if you are in this particular case and you do find that that's the circumstance, it is often worthwhile bringing in like an external person, like as I said, like bring in a Hawkeye, bring in a Vivacity, bring in somebody like us. There's quite a few really good consultants out there, and we'll help you, develop that plan for how you can address that systematic non-compliance, okay? Where you find it's a specific trainer, you fix the problem, you do the PD with the trainer, and you can generally like move on from it. Again, there is no one-stop solution to this because it really is going to depend on the size and scale of the issue and how critical the missing gap in evidence is to the non-compliance and how systematic it is across your tools, okay? One of the things I will say is when it's a tool-based problem, quite often that is going to be systematic because the way that we design our tools is we work from a template and all the tools are going to be the same. So if it's a tool template issue, if you're finding it in one unit, you do need to be keeping it in your mind and potentially thinking about how that impacts all your other units. The other thing that I'll say is like, generally when I've gone into RTOs that are in like an intent to cancel situation, ASQA has been very, very reasonable of us developing a schedule to improve all of those tools over a period of time in line with like a delivery calendar, okay? So that we go, It is going to take us 12 months before we've got fully compliant tools across everything, but we're going to build that and align that. Like, so there's an intensive part in the beginning where, like, you know, for example, you've got to rebuild 25% of your assessment tools in a very, very short period of time. You're usually going to need help to do that. But then the remaining 75%, you're going to develop those tools over that period in line with the delivery calendar that you've got, so that you're staying ahead of delivery, so that any of your new delivery that's happening is happening in line with compliant tools. But ASQA has actually always, in my experience, this is just my experience, they've been very, very reasonable in understanding that assessment is an iterative process. It's an iterative process. And where RTOs are investing in their assessment tools and they are improving over a period of time, and they are demonstrating a really good understanding of what good assessment practices are, both within their curriculum development team and also within the assessment staff, and they're even bringing in admin, you know, to check that process. They've been very, very reasonable in allowing a time frame for that to occur, and that gives the RTO a much better cash flow in order to be able to support good assessment development. Okay, where ASQA is not forgiving on this is where money is thrown at it once and you go out and you buy some generic solution, and there is not that investment within the college to contextualize and to understand what good assessment practices are, because throwing money at it once demonstrates that management doesn't understand what good assessment practices are, your trainers and assessors don't understand what good assessment practices are, and there's no professional development intent within the college or the RTO to understand what is the most, like the most crucial thing about running an RTO, which is collecting evidence of competency. So I've always found ASQA really, really reasonable. Again, this is just my experience. I'm sure people will disagree with me on it. But I've sat across dozens of audits across dozens of colleges. And 90% of the time, you know, ASQA has given us a time frame that we can go out and get everything fixed across a period, as opposed to expecting that every assessment tool is fixed, you know, by the end of that audit. Okay. So, you know, that regular validation process, that demonstrating that regular commitment to improvement is going to go a long way when you get into an audit with the regulator, because they're going to make a decision about intent pretty early in the piece, in my experience. And if it's clear that you don't have that continuous improvement quality intent, that's when we certainly see people struggling. Like, that's when we see that domino process, and that's when we see that intent. So regular professional development and understanding what good assessment processes is, and understanding validation, which is just something that RTOs struggle with because from a time perspective, is really, really crucial to being able to demonstrate your commitment to quality as an RTO. We're going to go more into general commitment to quality in our next couple of episodes, because we're going to be talking about governance in action and what governance in action actually looks like and what the new RTO standards say about it. Guys, I hope you found this series helpful. If you do have any questions, if you want any tips or tricks, by all means, feel free to reach out to us. You can reach out to us at laura@anawire.org or lauren@anawire.org. And we're happy to catch up and have a chat with you. We've got our amazing Crystal Robinson, who is out running validations on a regular basis with our clients. She'd be happy to run them with you too. So I hope you guys have found this helpful. My name is Lauren Boone for Anawire Education Services, and I hope you guys have an amazing day.